On March 20, 1922, the U.S. recommissioned the 12,000-ton Uss Langley. Originally entering service on April 7, 1913 as the 19,000-ton, fully loaded, coal ship Jupiter of the Proteus class, she boasted a couple firsts. First ship in the Navy to be powered by turboelectric drive, and first ship to officially pass west to east through the Panama Canal. On March 24, 1920, she began conversion to the U.S.'s first carrier. The conversion was simplistic and relatively cheap, but slow, an example of her experimental nature and the post-war drawdown. The coaling masts were removed and 13 towers were built on each side to support her 534 by 64 foot flight deck, giving her open sides and ends. Hold 4 was turned into the magazine with the elevator above it. Hold 1 was converted to aviation fuel storage. The other 4 holds carried spare aircraft parts. There was no island, her original bridge being retained below the flight deck, earning her the nickname of the Covered Wagon. The single funnel, soon doubled the funnels, were cranked upward out the port quarter and could be lowered during flight operations. She had one midship elevator, meaning if it ever became non-functional, she couldn't launch or recover aircraft. First one, and then a second catapult, was fitted, but these were useless, so they were removed in 1928. Maximum speed was 15 knots, meaning she couldn't hope to keep up with the fleet, a problem compounded by the need to constantly change course into the wind for launching and recovering aircraft. Armament was limited to low-angle guns, meaning she had no anti-aircraft guns to speak of. She had no armor. The TDS, or Torpedo Defense System, she had no TDS. Subdivision was minimal. Aircraft fuel and weapons capacity was limited. In short, she was inferior to even the later escort carriers that served in World War II, and should be considered an experimental carrier rather than a fleet carrier. Still, despite these drawbacks, Langley had one major advantage. She was the first. Not only that, but for roughly 5 years in the early to mid-20s, she was the only carrier. As such, she was the floating laboratory where carrier operations were developed. Things were tried, tinkered with, and retried or discarded. The Navy learned both what to do and what not to do on Langley. From her, the Navy was able to put together a wish list for future carriers. This led to this, which led to this. By the mid-30s, though, she was obviously outdated as a carrier, so she was converted again to free up carrier tonnage that was limited by treaty. More on that later. This time, she was converted into a seaplane tender. The forward third of her flight deck was removed along with the landing gear to make a well deck behind the bridge where seaplanes could be worked on. Cranes were added for moving the planes around. In addition to being a seaplane tender, the remains of her flight deck meant she was useful as an aircraft transport, though planes couldn't launch or land on her due to the lack of arresting gear, catapults, and its short length. Displacement dropped to 11,500 tons. Since her service in World War II was as a seaplane tender and aircraft transport, that's the configuration I'm going to focus on. Main armament was 4 low-angle 5-inch 51 caliber guns in single open mounts, one near each corner of the ship. Propulsion was provided by 3 boilers producing steam for 2 turbines. This produced electricity which powered the motors attached to the 2 shafts for developing 6,500 horsepower. These in turn produced a top speed of just over 15 knots. There was 1 rudder. No modifications we're speaking of were made during the war owing to her early loss. Langley was in the Philippines acting as a depot ship for reconnaissance seaplanes on December 7, 1941. It quickly became obvious the Philippines were undefensible, so along with the rest of the Asiatic fleet, she transferred to the East Indies, mostly supporting float planes conducting anti-submarine patrols out of Darwin, Australia. In late February 1942, she was tasked with carrying P-40 fighters from Darwin to Java. While nearing Java on February 27, 1942, she was spotted along with her escorts, the flush-deck destroyers Whipple and Edsel. Land-based dive bombers hit her 5 times on the third strike. Burning, listing, and dead in the water, she was scuttled by 2 torpedoes. The primary U.S. aircraft torpedo of World War II was the MK13. Initially starting development as far back as the mid-20s, work was a start-stop affair until 1938 when it finally entered service. Part of the reason for this was technical, part budgetary, but the major reason was the low doctrinal priority assigned to airborne torpedoes. Torpedoes cost a lot more to develop and build than bombs. The Depression. Also, for the torpedo designers themselves, the priority in the early 30s was the whiz-bang fizzle Mark 14 Wonder torpedo with its magnetic detonator. Torpedoes also had the operational liability of being rather limited in their usage. You can bomb a ship, but you can't torpedo a building. Torpedoes are also larger and heavier than most bombs. This means the aircraft that carried them have to be larger and thus more expensive. Larger aircraft means less aircraft can be carried, and a longer flight deck is needed to take off and land. Remember, the treaty limited both individual and total hull tonnage. For the aircraft themselves, carrying torpedoes was a liability. The sheer weight and size of the torpedo meant only one could be carried, so you got one shot and not a lot of reloads could be carried. It also bit heavily into the aircraft's maximum speed, range, and maneuverability. Then there's the attack. Whereas dive bombers could soar high over their target out of range of AA guns and choose the right moment to strike, torpedo planes have to fly straight, low, and close, making them easy targets for combat air patrol and anti-aircraft gunners. Keep in mind, in the late 20s and early 30s, aircraft were fabric-winged biplanes. Also, most torpedoes at the time were slow, making them easy to avoid unless there was a lot of them, and there wasn't. They were also relatively light, whereas most battleships had thick side armor and were thought to have a robust TDS. Dive bombers, on the other hand, struck at the relatively thin deck armor. Remember, Toronto, the Bismarck, Pearl Harbor, Prince of Wales and Repulse, the Sibuyan Sea, and the Yamato were 10 years in the future, while Billy Mitchell's sinking of the Ostfriesland was 10 years in the past. Eventually, carriers would start using them again once tonnage allowed them to be carried. But by focusing on dive bombers rather than torpedo planes, in the treaty-restricted near term, the Navy was able to cut a little off the tight budget and focus on the cheaper, more versatile tactic, which also allowed smaller carriers. So, torpedo designers were focused on the Mark 14 submarine torpedo, while aircraft designers were focused on dive bombers. As a result, like the Mark 14, initial versions were badly flawed, tending to run deep and being duds. In one pre-war test, only 10%, 1 in 10, ran correctly. By mid-1943, this had marginally improved to 30%. Improvements such as collars around the nose and propeller helped to the point that by the end of the war, nearly 95% ran straight and true. The torpedo itself was 13 3/4 feet long and 22 1/4 inches in diameter, meaning whereas most countries' aircraft torpedoes were narrow and long, it was short and wide. Weight on later versions was 2,216 pounds. Warhead weight was about 600 pounds. Range was 2 miles at 33.5 knots. Propulsion was by a wet heater steam turbine. Early versions had a dismal maximum drop speed height combination of 50 feet at 110 knots. In later versions, though, this improved considerably to 2,400 feet at 410 knots, aiding considerably the survivability of the launching aircraft. By the end of World War II, these were the best aircraft-launched anti-ship torpedoes anywhere in the world. The other aircraft torpedo I'm going to cover is the Mark 24 FIDO. Beginning development in 1941 and entering service in mid-1943, it was realistically the first anti-submarine torpedo. FIDO was 19 inches wide and 7 feet long. Weighing 680 pounds, it used a 92-pound Torpex contact warhead. Propulsion was provided by a lead-acid battery that gave it a speed of 12 knots for 2 miles, i.e. 15 minutes. This doesn't sound like much, but you have to remember most U-boats had a top submerged speed of only about 7 knots. Guidance was by 4 hydrophones arrayed around the mid-body of the torpedo at 12 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 6 o'clock, and 9 o'clock, which simply homed in on the loudest noise. Like modern homing torpedoes, searching was initially done in a circular pattern at 50 feet, but this was soon increased to 150 feet. Minimum depth was 40 feet to prevent it from accidentally attacking surface ships. So, how'd it do? While depth charges achieved a 9.5% success rate, FIDO achieved an incredible 22% success rate.